Hi everyone, it's time for another Q&A video. I'm going to answer some of your questions. So I've asked my patrons, my wonderful, wonderful patrons, to ask me some questions, and I will do my best to answer them right now. So let's just get started. Okay, so Mohammed asks, in your opinion, what was the main cause behind the fail of rationalist and mystical schools of thought in Islam in favor of more hardline and legalistic schools of thought? Uh, I love that this is the kind of questions I get. I was expecting, what's your favorite color, and this is what I get. I love it. So this is obviously a very complex question. Uh, I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to here. One thing could be that you're referring to the early development of theology and legal or fiqh jurisprudence in the early Muslim community or civilization. Um, in that case, I think, first of all, that we should be careful not to create this kind of dichotomy between rationalism and irrationalism, and that the irrationalist somehow won. That's not a very helpful way to look at it. But if you're referring to the debate between the well, people like the Mu'tazila or the more personal opinion oriented jurists versus the more legalist interpretations or people, often known as the traditionalist or the Ahl al-Hadith. In that case, I think there are many different factors that contributed to the eventual victory or the fact that the traditionalists gained the upper hand. I think one reason is that their approach to things was more appealing to the general masses, to the regular person who wasn't educated in theology or law. They presented first of all, a theology that was more graspable, a God that was more anthropomorphic, that was more personal, that people could imagine and devote their prayers to in a more direct way. In terms of law, there was a lot more defined boundaries and rules, whereas the other camp was sometimes a little more fuzzy in that regard, having taking personal opinion into regard, and thus resulting in many different practices in different regions, whereas the more strict, the literalist interpretation allowed for a more unified practice throughout the empire that was also, of course, very appealing and very useful in that sense. I think another factor is that in terms of theology, as we talked about in one video, the Mu'tazila was adopted by certain leaders like al-Ma'mun and actually forcibly implemented. He forced certain scholars to accept Mu'tazili positions like the creativeness of the Quran and similar practices which led to the general opinion that movements like the Mu'tazila and related ideas became associated with tyrannical and oppressive rulers, whereas its counterpart was associated with these pious scholars who stood up for their beliefs. But on the other hand, we should also remember that even though the traditionalist camp, the Ahl al-Hadith, was of course very influential and eclipsed the Mu'tazila and the what you refer to as rationalist movements, the people who actually was victorious in the end were the Asharis and the Maturidis, at least in terms of theology, and they tried to create a kind of synthesis, a compromise in between the two extreme positions, and also applied reason and rational thought to their theology, while also taking into account the more literalist approaches at the same time. So to say that reason or the rationalist approach fell in some way is, as I said in the beginning, somewhat of an unhelpful way to look at it. You also talk about the fall of the mystical schools of thought, which leads me to believe that maybe you're actually referring to much later developments in the maybe 19th century, because Sufism or Tasawwuf actually only became more and more popular during the first couple of centuries of the Islamic civilization, to the point that in the Middle Ages and forward, it would become like almost a majority expression of Islam, and remained so until around the 19th century. And when it did start to decline in popularity at this point, that was actually in part because of rationalist schools of thought. Because in the 19th century, we have these movements and scholars who we often refer to as Islamic modernists. It's associated with people like Al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu and his student Rashid Rida. And these scholars were often very critical of Sufism. They saw Sufism as this old superstition, whereas they were promoting a more rationalist, a more modernist approach to Islam. They saw the pure version, original version of Islam as this rational religion, and some of these Sufi practices like visiting the saints or graves of saints, shrines, and intercessionary prayers as later superstitious, rational innovations to the religion. And so what they were trying to do was to reform Islam, to remove these superstitious old aspects and to restore it to this pristine, rational form in which Sufism really didn't have much of a place. And so this is, I think, the main reason, or one of the main reasons, why Sufism is not as prominent today at all, especially compared to the way, how popular it was and how widespread it was before this time, up until the mid-19th century. This is because these kind of modernist, rationalist approaches to the religion became very popular across the Islamic world. It did lead to everything from the Salafis to the Islamic State. These are all also based on this kind of reform, rationalist, modernist approach to the religion, anti-tradition. But it also led to things like Islamic feminism, progressivism. So it's a very wide span. But nonetheless, this general approach, this rational, modernist approach, is definitely at least one of the main factors, in my mind, behind the decline in popularity and practice of mysticism and Sufism in the Islamic world today. So in the end, any kind of dichotomy like this between rational or legalist or rational and Sufi, for that matter, of course, I now presented a view where rationalist and Sufi was opposed to each other, which is not necessarily the case either, but nonetheless, we can see that mysticism and rationalism does not always go together, but also that we should always avoid these kind of strong divisions and dichotomies when talking about the history of anything, really. It's rarely very helpful. Okay, question by Despacitus. If you could time travel or witness a life in a certain place, where would that be and in which era? This is such a difficult question because obviously I would like to travel to every single destination in every single time period, because every time period is interesting. There's always something that you would like to know more about or something you would like to experience. So this is almost impossible for me to answer. Well, because, of course, I am a scholar of religion, and I focused on things like Islam and the Middle East, I would, of course, like to go back to Palestine in the 1st century and see what Jesus was up to. Maybe ask him, like, who are you? What are you doing? Or, for that matter, also maybe go to Medina or Mecca in the 7th century and experience what it was like in the community of the Prophet Muhammad, for example. These things would be, of course, incredibly interesting. But there's also something to be said for the fact that things maybe sometimes should be left a mystery. There's a kind of romantic notion that we have about certain historical events or places, and I think in a lot of cases, if we were to actually experience them, it wouldn't really be like we expected it to be, and we would be somewhat disappointed. Reality is rarely as interesting as the way we imagine or romanticize reality, so maybe some things are best left mysteries, and some questions are best left unanswered. But I can't deny the fact that it would be really interesting to see what happened in, for example, in the communities of Jesus or Muhammad. So that would be one of my answers, at least. Question number 3 from Eric Goodemot. Excuse me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Have you ever heard of a religion called Yarisanism? Yes, I have. Yarisanism is a very interesting religious movement from what is today Iran and in Persia. It is connected to Sufism, of course. It's also known as the Ahli Haq, the people of truth. I don't know all that much about them. There are some of you who have requested me to make a video about them at some point, and I might actually do that, but I would have to do some more research because it's a field that I am not that familiar with. I do have certain acquaintances and friends, especially some musician friends, who are loosely connected to the Ali Haq movement, so I'm also familiar with them in that sense. They have, of course, very strong musical traditions. They love to play the tambour, which is an amazing instrument. But more than that, I don't know that much. I know that there's a strong connection to Sufism, but also certain local Persian traditions, and so I will definitely explore that in the future in some video. But for now, my answer is yes, I know about them, but I don't know that much about them. We also have a question from a Lulia Forge. Again, I'm sorry about these pronunciations, but the question is, why are you interested in Sufism and the lives of Sufi saints? Why especially North Africa? Do you think that there have been a decline in Sufi practices in the last 100 years? In terms of the very last question, yes, I did tackle some of that in the first question. Certainly, Sufism has declined to some degree in popularity in the Islamic world since the 19th century, at least in comparison to the widespread flourishing of Sufism that was before that. But at the same time, I think in the last few decades or so, Sufism has also started to see a kind of resurgence. Some people have seen Sufism as a kind of antidote to more extremist ideologies like the Salafis or Wahhabis. Of course, if that's a legitimate position, this is a question for another time. But certainly, I think Sufism is starting to gain followers or gain popularity again, both in the Islamic world but also outside in the West and different kinds of Sufi movements. So yes and no, I guess. As for the other question, why are you interested in Sufism and the lives of Sufi saints? Well, who wouldn't be? I mean, you've seen my videos. I think it's just such a fascinating subject. The Sufis are some of the most interesting and fascinating people I think who have ever lived. I just love the way that the Sufis and, well, mystics in general express their kind of experiences, their ideas. It's rarely in a kind of dry philosophical manner like what regular philosophers would do, like arguments and explanations. And instead, the Sufis and the mystics, they just kind of throw things out there. They experience things, and then they just, often in poetry or in verse or in music, they express these experiences in very fascinating and inspiring ways. And so I guess that's one of the reasons. It's just such a colorful and wonderful and philosophically appealing often thing that I just completely fell in love with at some point. And why especially North Africa? I don't know. I don't know if I am especially interested in North Africa. I think on this channel I have focused a lot on Sufism in Andalusia and the Maghrib, North Africa. I've done videos on Ibn Arabi, on Ibn Sabain, al-Shushtari, Ibn Khaldun, all of whom, Ibn Tufayl too, all of whom come from this region. I think one of the reasons is that Persian Sufism gets all the fame. People love to talk about Rumi, Hafiz, and Attar. And of course, we should talk about them because they're amazing, but there's so much about them already. You can find so much information. I think the Sufis of the Western regions in these Maghrib and southern Spain are often forgotten, except for Ibn Arabi. And so that's one of the reasons why I have been interested in focusing on them in particular to highlight some of these people who tend to be forgotten in these kinds of discussions, but nonetheless have a lot to offer and have impacted Sufism and mysticism in general to a very large degree. So that would be my main answer. Okay, the patron Nathan P asks, what is your dream for the channel and where would you like it to go? Well, I think my dream for the channel was for it to be basically where it is right now, that it is a kind of hub or a forum where we can spread knowledge about religion, about all aspects related to religion, and to create a more open, a more informed discussion about these subjects, both in a kind of top-down manner as for the channel to be a source of information, but also for the channel to be a source for discussion in things like the comments and so on. That's definitely one of the goals I have with it. I would like to extend the scope of the channel too, to maybe collaborate with other people, have other scholars, perhaps do certain videos or host videos or series. We'll see where that's gonna go, but I have some of those plans to expand the channel to a certain degree. Okay, last question also from Nathan. Where do you think religion could go in the future? The issues with modernization you may see. This is a very, very difficult question. A couple of decades ago, the kind of scholarly consensus or scholarly trend was to say that religion was on its way out, that in a century or two, religion would be completely gone, replaced by scientific progress or rational thought. Now, of course, a couple of decades later now, we know that that was very inaccurate. Religion has actually resurfaced. It's only become more popular lately. So it's very difficult to say. There are various reasons for this. And religion also, I think, evolves as it always has. We will evolve over time. In one video, I talked about this phenomenon, which is often called believing without belonging. Even though religious institutions like Christianity, for example, the church does not have the same power as it used to, and people don't identify with these larger institutions in the same way that they used to. Nonetheless, people continue to a very large degree to believe in things and to practice different kinds of, well, religious or spiritual practices. People believe in gods or spirits. They believe in an afterlife. So even if religions, as in the big religions, will decrease or lose more power, which it's not seeming like it will in any time soon, but even if so, I think religion will live on in some other way. You can have different theories about it, but there seems to be something inherently human in our human nature that just wants to express itself in a certain way. And so I think religion in its various forms is not going anywhere anytime soon, but in what form it will remain is very hard to say. So that, I guess we'll see. So that was all the questions for now. I hope that was at least somewhat understandable and satisfying, and that I wasn't just rambling the entire way through. I'll do one of these sometime soon, maybe once every 2 months or so. And if you want to get the opportunity to ask questions for these Q&A videos, then you should become a patron. I will leave a link to my Patreon page in the description. And so you can check out the different tiers, you can make a decision, and you will get wonderful exclusive rights, exclusive exclusive benefits like this one. You get to ask me questions that I can vaguely answer in these Q&A videos. Until then, I'll be releasing videos, hopefully on a weekly basis, at least in the foreseeable future. I'm working on a couple of things right now, which I will not disclose yet, but look forward to that soon. And yeah, I'll see you next time.